Well, hello, everybody. Sarah's running late. Let's go ahead and call the meeting to order. Clerk, will you call the roll?
Agent,
Here.
Halliburton,
Here.
Inky,
Here.
Ash,
Here.
Willits, Whittings,
Here.
5 present, 1 absent.
All right. First up, Eric, welcome. We've got interim budget changes.
Thank you very much, Madam Mayor, members of the council. We have 11 interim budget changes for your consideration this afternoon, all but one of which are revenue neutral or budget neutral. The first item is in our Arts and History Department. It is a CCDC funded project at Irma Hayman House. That funding would allow for the installation of signage, a lighting system, and an outdoor projector to display artwork. Our second item is sponsorship funding in support of the 2023 Pride Parade. This request comes at the request of council members Halliburton and Whittings, and would be combined with a $10,000 in-kind contribution from the Office of the Mayor to cover costs such as police or parking fees. Our third item is for various fire department related grants totaling approximately $500,000 for equipment, technology, and training associated with various specialty teams. Our fourth item is for cloud-based web filtering software to protect users from accessing suspect websites when not working on the city's network. This project will be funded from the project portfolio contingency, which was approved by the City Council as part of the fiscal year 23 adopted budget. Our fifth item is associated with the permit management system, and it would configure that system to reflect the new zoning districts that were included in the recently approved modern zoning code. This project would be funded $25,000 from Planning and Development Services Department M&O savings and $65,000 from the aforementioned project portfolio contingency. Our sixth item is for investments at Idaho Ice World. These investments would be funded utilizing the Idaho Ice World Reserve, as well as sponsorship revenue. And the improvements would fund dehumidifier improvements, LED upgrade, and a divider curtain out at that facility. Our seventh item is for non-congregate sheltering services. This funding was contemplated in the development of the fiscal year 2024 budget, which includes funding from October 1st through mid-April of 2024. This particular investment would allow for the continuation of those services through the end of this calendar year. And those shelter services are anticipated to be available until a new expanded and permanent overnight shelter is available. Our eighth item is for early implementation costs associated with the modern zoning code, which has a December 1st, 2023 implementation date. Advancement of those investments that were included in the fiscal year 24 proposed budget are recommended so that the implementation work can begin. And the investments include a contract for a hearing examiner, certain hiring activities associated with the senior admin specialist and the senior planner, and professional services funding to align the modern zoning code with city design standards, Planning and Development Services Department policies and procedures, as well as the climate action roadmap. That third element, I'll note, did have funding included in the fiscal year 24 proposed budget. We would expect to see a subsequent interim budget change to remove that funding in fiscal year 2024 due to this advancement. Our ninth item is a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice for the Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act grant, $66,000 to pilot police's mental health and wellness program aimed at officers and their families civilian support staff, chaplains, and retirees using training workshops and other ongoing education. Our 10th item is for recycled water characterization costs. This item would be funded from fund balance within the Water Renewal Fund. The investment totals $1.2 million, and it would ensure site characterization of potential sites for the future recycled water facility and groundwater recharge site can proceed without any interruption. And our last item is an information-only item associated with previously approved investments at the downtown library. In May, there was an IBC that was approved by the council that indicated that 3 projects, the first floor renovations, the main library space study, and the 4th floor renovations would be accounted for in distinct projects. However, upon further review, the recommendation is to fold those into existing projects. So in subsequent quarterly reports and capital status reports, you'll see those items folded into those 2 other projects. With that, I'd be happy to stand for any questions the council might have.
Madam Mayor, no questions, just a couple comments. There's some just really, really amazing things in some of these changes, partnerships with other organizations, some much needed renovations at the downtown library, and then even lots of things that are grant funded, and really excited about the mental health and wellness grant with the police department. It's so great to see some of these things in here. There is some use of council contingency funds, and when I was looking through this, I remember that Council President Woodings had brought this up earlier in the year of like, how do we actually use our council contingency funds, how that might change as we're moving into districts and trying to clarify a process in which that's going to happen. And I don't know that we ever landed on this is what we're going to do, and that's how that process is going to work. And I just wanted to make sure that I had it on the record and requested that in the future that we continue that conversation so that we can really make sure that we're doing our job on council, making the process clear and easy, the same way that you all work within the rest of your departments to make that process clear and easy as well. So just a request for a future conversation related to council contingency funds and that process going forward, especially as we move into districts in conjunction with that initial conversation, Council President Woodings, that you brought up several months ago.
Madam Mayor. Yeah, I completely agree. I want to have that conversation as well. And I will personally commit when it comes in September, October to calling Holly and looping her in on that so she's up to speed.
Right, anything further?
Madam Mayor,
Yeah.
I commit to being available and be helpful in any way that I possibly can to my fellow council members. And if there are no further questions, I move that we approve the interim budget change as presented.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any additional conversation? All right, clerk, we call the roll.
Woodings,
Yes.
Agent,
Yes.
Halliburton,
Yes.
Keith,
Yes.
Ash,
Yes.
all in favor, motion carries.
Thank you, Eric. And next up, we have Nikki Hellenkamp. And looks like a team of folks actually that are here to present the tenant protections ordinance. We have on here 40 minutes because we just didn't update the agenda. It'll be half an hour. And that's what you were planning for. That's what we were planning for. Great. And as you'll recall, Nikki was with us in the spring, took feedback from council, and council asked her to do engagement with stakeholders, with the public, and then to return with information and recommendations based on that.
Thanks very much, Madam Mayor, members of council. Nikki Hellenkamp, pleasure to be here with you today. As the mayor mentioned, with the challenging housing market that we have seen in Boise and across the state in recent years, council, with the mayor's support, has directed staff to look at all of the tools we have to address housing affordability, stability, and access. The city has taken action on this front by allocating funds for the development of affordable housing and by moving forward a modernized zoning code that attempts to allow the market to better address our community's housing supply needs. A third area that this council has taken previous action on and directed staff to look at further relates to tenant protections. Given that about 40% of Boise households are renting their homes, this is an issue that's relevant not only to those individual renters and their landlords, but also to businesses for whom housing stability for their employees often translates to workforce stability, to institutes of higher education whose students and staff are often reliant on the rental housing market, and to any Boiseans who want to live in a community where it's possible for people to access housing and to stay in their homes. In looking at the question of how prevalent the community concerns around housing access and stability are, we looked at some research that was done by the Idaho Policy Institute. This is from their 2023 Public Policy Survey. And they asked Idahoans across the state the question, if you had to move out of your home today for whatever reason, how likely is it that you would be able to purchase or rent a similar home for the same amount? And you can see that nearly 69% of Idahoans said that this would be unlikely. In asking the question of whether this is a widespread concern, we can see here that we likely do have many people in our community who may be concerned about what they would do if they lost their housing. And so really wanting to take a look here at housing access and stability, and in particular at the tenant protections that we discussed previously. The draft ordinances that we're bringing forward today are the result of conversations that we've had with key stakeholders, including both landlord and tenant groups. Unsurprisingly, we've heard from many tenant advocates that the proposed ordinances don't go far enough. And there are also some landlords who feel that any action taken by the city to regulate their industry is unacceptable. In the ordinances we're bringing you today, we've worked to try to balance the perspectives of both groups. And we believe that they represent a measured approach that would improve housing stability and access in our community without creating undue burden on housing providers. And I'll also say that they've been crafted with a lot of input from those landlord groups about how to address their concerns. So we're here to get your feedback today on those drafts, as well as your direction for possible next steps. The last time you took up this topic, we looked at some proposed solutions that community groups in Boise had identified as being potentially effective tools to address barriers to housing access and stability for renters. And you asked for additional discussion around the following. I've got the 4 up there just as a reminder. And you also asked that staff conduct stakeholder and community outreach and come back to council with the results of that with the draft ordinances. So between the 4 proposals and the stakeholder and community outreach, we've got kind of a full plate in front of us. So I'm going to do my best to move us through as best I can. I'm going to take us through the results of that outreach generally, and then as it relates to each of the specific proposals that you have before you for your consideration. And since we have a lot to get through, I would welcome any questions you have as we go along, just so that you don't lose track of them. It is Rail Week here in Boise, so I was going to try to turn that don't lose track of it into some kind of train metaphor, but I just didn't have it in me. If somebody has, notes afterwards, let me know. Always welcome a train related metaphor. So with that, let's leave the station and I'll tell you what we've been doing. So targeted stakeholder engagement. Our targeted stakeholder outreach has consisted of meeting directly with about a dozen groups that work with tenants and that represent landlords, rental property managers, and owners of rental properties. And I'll say that these groups were really generous with their time across the board and provided valuable feedback, both in terms of the big picture policy goals and in terms of how to ensure that these ordinances, if passed, would achieve the goals of making housing more accessible and stable for residents, while not, again, placing an unnecessary burden on housing providers. We also conducted 5 community outreach sessions for the general public. 4 of them were in-person evening meetings in areas of our city that have the highest population of people who rent their homes. And we held an internal focus group here with City of Boise employees who volunteered to share their input. We also launched a webpage that mirrored the in-person experience, featuring a comment form for people to provide feedback digitally. And in a moment, I will go over kind of the results of that community outreach. The online survey was certainly the most robust form of response that we got from the community on these, from the general community on these proposals. We had over 100 responses. 60% of those were from people who said they were renters in Boise. And of those, 70% said that the proposed protections address issues facing renters. The remaining 30% in the open comment section indicated that they didn't feel that the proposed protections addressed issues facing renters because they do not go far enough. And almost nearly 100% of the time, the reason they were saying that had to do with affordability, that about half of the renters use the open comment section to specifically voice a desire for some kind of cap or limitation on rent increases. So that is something that came through very loud and clear from that outreach. And of course, under state law, the city of Boise does not have the ability to impose a cap or limitation on rent increases. And so then the question that we really got into in more depth with our stakeholder groups was, so if we can't address affordability because of these limitations from the state, then what is within our power as a city to address when it comes to stability and access for our residents? So some common overall messages from renters. And again, I'm going to give you big picture overall messages we heard and then go through each of the proposals and what we heard there. So overall, as I mentioned, support for the proposals, certainly a lot of stories of the stress and fear that result from a lack of housing stability and access. I mentioned before concerns that the proposals don't go far enough. We received a good number of questions about protections that already exist. So pointing to the need for education and making people aware. And also requests to address additional issues, including things like housing quality. From landlords, we heard a concern that the protections will create an unnecessary burden, concern that tenants who are not paying rent or otherwise violating their lease would somehow be protected from eviction by these protections. We heard a preference for state level legislation, a concern that landlords who don't wish to comply may leave the market, and from some, a belief that the measures are just unnecessary or aren't responding to a real need in our community. I'll address these concerns and how we took them into account as we drafted ordinances when we go through those specific protections. But I will say now that with the engagement we did, we feel that we, again, worked really hard to balance the concerns and priorities of both parties. And again, we really benefited from the landlord group's willingness to engage with us on how to reduce that burden. So starting with prohibiting retaliation, the feedback we received from stakeholders on this, tenant advocacy groups reported retaliation as a frequent area of concern that they hear from folks reaching out for assistance. We heard some opposition from landlord groups on this one, while others did not have concerns. So, hearing kind of a mixed bag here. I think one thing that helped some of those landlord groups feel more comfortable with it was we did have some questions related to how retaliatory actions would be defined. And so there was a question, for example, one of the protected activities for tenants is if a tenant hires an attorney to represent them, that then they shouldn't be retaliated against for doing so. And we got a question from landlords around, okay, well, if my tenant hires an attorney and then I hire an attorney because they hired an attorney, then did I just retaliate against them by hiring an attorney? So of course, in that case, no, hiring your own attorney would not be considered a retaliatory action. And listed on the left, there are a few examples from the ordinance of what could be considered retaliatory actions to really make that clear for folks. So that was one of the areas where we were able to take that feedback and make sure it was really addressed in the ordinance. And the language there around what those retaliatory actions could consist of is taken from state code. The next one was a notice of rights and responsibilities. We heard general agreement from both tenant and landlord groups on this, that this seemed like something that they could get behind, particularly once their concerns were addressed. And I'll say the biggest concern we received on this one was just a worry from landlords that, am I going to be responsible for creating this notice of rights and responsibilities? And how am I supposed to do that? So being able to help people understand, no, that wouldn't be your responsibility. That would be the responsibility of the city. Your responsibility would just be to share the link, which you could do in your lease agreement or whatever format you prefer. We got lots of great suggestions from that stakeholder engagement about the resources to include. We received requests for the document to be made available in multiple languages and a real emphasis on the need for clear and concise language. So that was some of the kind of helpful feedback we received on that one.
Madam Mayor, On this one, just to be clear, we don't have this document outlined already, or do we have a draft of the document in place?
Madam Mayor, Council Member, thank you. We do not currently have a draft in place. The feedback that we received from stakeholders in the community group gave us a great list of things that we could potentially include. And if this was something that the council wanted to move forward, would be happy to come back with a draft if that's of interest. And would be looking for a lot of feedback from those groups that support tenants, as well as from landlords around, does this hit the mark? Do we need to make changes? That kind of thing.
Perfect. Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I think early on we talked about posting this in a common area, particularly on like a larger rental property. Can you talk through kind of the decision to provide a link rather than having it physically posted?
Sure. Madam Mayor, Council President Woodings, one of the things we heard from the housing providers was a concern. They said, this happens all the time where if we print something and it goes out of date, we don't know. And then we're responsible because we've got a 3-year-old thing on the wall and we didn't update whatever it is. And so what we went with in this draft is to say, okay, your responsibility is just to provide the URL. We will make sure that it's updated, but we've also had some good conversation internally about how the city could provide physical copies at, libraries, other kinds of locations where people, would be able to access them and would again take the responsibility for making sure that they're up to date and correct.
Yeah, I think that piece is really important because we get links to things all the time, but then you forget that you got that link. And so I think that just having that kind of physical reminder in a accessible place where people can see it, that they do have rights and, and are able to access what those rights are is really important. And I don't know if it's like a QR code that takes them to the page or something like that, but I think that having that physical presence is critical.
Thank you. Okay. Next, we have source of income discrimination. In terms of the feedback we received on this, tenant groups identified this as a really common barrier to housing for Boise residents who use subsidies, child support, emergency rental assistance, and other sources of income to help pay their rent. We certainly heard opposition to this from some landlords, particularly in terms of concerns around administrative burden. And I will say, I think some of those concerns are fair, and because there are things that a landlord has to do with some subsidy programs in order to comply. And I think there are also some very common misconceptions about the way that these subsidy programs operate that are out there in the community that cause people fear and worry, but may not actually, hold up as real. So, and we also heard from some landlord groups that they didn't have concerns around this issue. I think the education piece is really going to be key here as we consider this one. And I will say that efforts are already underway between several of the landlord groups that have connected with the Housing Authority to discuss collaborating on trainings for their membership so that people have the opportunity to ask questions, get clarity on some of those common misperceptions, and be prepared to comply if an ordinance is passed. So, like I said, those conversations are kind of in early stages, but really looking at how would education make it possible for this to be, again, the least burden on a housing provider that is possible. And finally, relocation assistance. So this one was certainly a big topic of discussion here with you all and certainly out in the community. So on the left here in the blue, these are the 4 options that you all discussed and that we also took out into those community conversations in terms of what relocation assistance could look like. And as you'll remember, we left this very broad because we wanted to get a better understanding of what might make sense in the context of the Boise housing market, in the context of our Idaho legal context. So some of the common areas of concern around this that we heard, one had to do with the question of applying a one-size-fits-all approach to situations that might be quite different, right? Depending on the income, depending on the demographics of a specific, building, you might have different needs in terms of what that assistance in order to be effective would look like. And under the current zoning code, there is some ability for that case-by-case basis to be taken into account through the requirement for a conditional use permit. I will say that the option for assistance with the housing search was not particularly popular with landlord or tenant groups, so would not necessarily recommend that one. And certainly area of concern around legal risks to requiring cash payment or increased notice. So where we really landed with this was the full security deposit return. And again, this is only in situations where you're talking about tenants who are being permanently displaced due to demolition or substantial rehab. That permanent displacement piece was another thing that an area of concern we heard from housing providers of wanting to make sure it was clear that this isn't a situation where a security deposit is being returned because this is the end of our tenant landlord relationship. It's not a situation where it's a fire or flood and somebody is going to be returning back to their unit. So wanting to make sure that that is clear. And I mean, essentially what we're talking about here is that the idea that when a building is being demolished or substantially rehabbed and people have to permanently relocate as a result, they would at minimum have the peace of mind of knowing that they could count on the full return of their security deposit because the building's coming down, right? So to know that you're not going to have to go through the back and forth of, is this more than usual wear and tear on the carpet? Is the paint scuffed, right? Because these walls are going to get knocked down anyway. To have that peace of mind to be able to count on that money coming back to them in the time frame required by state law and to plan accordingly. We heard support from tenants for any kind of additional protection in these situations, but certainly some concern that this does not go far enough in addressing the larger costs and impact of displacement. And after some strong initial opposition to the idea of relocation assistance, we heard from landlord groups that they had far fewer concerns. I'm going to fix my slide. Far fewer instead of no concerns around security deposit return as being kind of where to land here.
Madam Mayor. Thank you. I'm just looking at the overview here on the guaranteed security deposit return and the kind of exception there for except in extreme circumstances. Can you talk a little bit more about how we define what that means?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Haney-Keith, yes, thank you for the question. In the draft ordinance, it speaks to creating a rebuttable presumption that there is a full return of the security deposit. And the ordinance itself gives the example of an extreme case as one in which a tenant has damaged or removed fixtures that the landlord had planned to reuse or sell. So if somebody's removed toilets or, essentially taken things that could have been reused and that were of value, that in that kind of situation, then there might be an argument to be made that, the value of whatever was removed should be taken from the security deposit. Great. We received lots of questions about how these ordinances would be enforced. And so I'll say that currently the city's residential rental application fee ordinance is enforced through code compliance. And after conversation with code compliance, their recommendation was to, if these ordinances were passed, to monitor the volume of complaints and assess whether additional resources are needed. We received requests from community members to make the enforcement process as predictable and transparent as possible for all parties. So in terms of the way this works is, violations can be reported by email or phone to our code compliance team. Code compliance then investigates, educates, and provides the opportunity to come into compliance if an ordinance appears to have been violated. If after that opportunity has been given, someone fails to comply, this could potentially result in an infraction, and multiple instances of just flagrantly, deciding not to comply with an ordinance that you've been made aware of its existence could potentially result in a misdemeanor. And that's typical of how code compliance operates in general, which is always seeking, education and compliance as a first step. So in terms of potential next steps, we did hear a request from several groups for if this was something that council decided to move forward on, for a delayed implementation date to push out to January 1st to allow for those education efforts that I mentioned earlier. And I'll say that I think that would also be in the best interest of the city. So the implementation efforts wouldn't be rushed if that's something that the council decides to move forward. So with that, we're just seeking your feedback as well as direction in terms of next steps. I'm happy to stand for questions.
Madam Mayor, I have three, so I can just go through them, specific pieces of feedback or questions about the income discrimination provisions. And it's all based on the draft ordinance you sent. The first was I noticed that you've done the Mrs. Murphy type exception for somebody who is renting a room in their home or a duplex where it's owner occupied and then renting out the second one. And I think that's awesome. But it's defined as people who are two families inside of one building, and that therefore wouldn't apply to an ADU where one of the properties is owner occupied. I think one of the goals of our zoning code is to encourage people to be renting out their ADUs. So it's probably tricky to write in a way that includes two separate buildings in the ADU situation, but doesn't create a loophole for property managers. My direction would be to figure it out. But I wanted to flag that because I do think there's a policy goal in our zoning code that we inadvertently missed a little bit here. On the income discrimination, the types of income that can't be discriminated against, there's a list. I personally would add small business income or K1 income because people in that situation, somebody especially just starting a business often has a very hard time with lenders in other places, and I'm sure it's true of landlords. Personally, and the rest of the council members may feel differently, I would exclude gift income. I think it's perfectly reasonable for a landlord to say, wait a minute, you've documented your income based on a $5,000 gift from a stranger, and I have questions about that because I need to enter a business relationship with you. So that's my personal view. Others may disagree. And then the last piece of feedback has to do with the way we set this up. We added it to the non-discrimination ordinance, which makes sense. It's a different type of discrimination, but there's some features of that ordinance that have to do with gender identity, et cetera, and then religious organizations. So there's a carve out, for example, the ordinance doesn't apply at all to churches. Well, we probably do want churches to be not discriminating on the basis of income, and there's no religious objection there. So we may need to carve up what portions do and don't apply to the religious exemption, if that makes sense. And then totally ticky-tacky, instead of saying in the ordinance, nothing that interferes with Boy Scouts versus Dale, which is a very old discrimination case, it all just got rewritten by this new Supreme Court opinion in through Ethic Creative. Maybe just say it doesn't violate federal law.
Madam Mayor, I think just a question maybe to follow up there. I knew that Councilmember Bajent would come with some very, very specific things related to language, so I appreciate you doing that. Is gifts considered a legal source of income? It is.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Halliburton. Yes, this is something that's commonly included in this type of ordinance. And would be as long as it's considered, as long as it's legal and verifiable. Sometimes you have a situation where someone is receiving an ongoing gift, like in the form of an allowance from a parent. And sometimes that can be counted in that way as income. But I'd have to do some more kind of looking into that to see how that's been treated in other places.
Thank you.
I just want to thank Nikki for her really hard work on this. I know that you've been doing a ton of research and been working diligently with legal to make drafts of all of these ordinances. It was really interesting because we had an interaction with our neighbor yesterday, and he was asking us, because he lives in a basement apartment that apparently has a ton of spiders. And he's like, how do I get rid of spiders? Like, it's not your house, call your landlord. And he was kind of like a little bit nervous about, well, what if I call my landlord and what if they get upset? And I'm like, they can't, it's illegal for them to retaliate against you. And so I know that there's case law that says that, but I think that adding this extra layer of awareness and a city ordinance to really back that up could have a lot of teeth and really help out a lot of people. So I would just want to thank you for your work. I think it's really important.
Madam Mayor. Nikki, did you discuss any other places in code that we might put this other than the general discrimination section?
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Nash, you're speaking specifically about the source of income discrimination piece to
Yes.
Councilmember Bajan's concerns. Yeah, so we did, and I will answer this short, and then I can follow up with you with more information. I know that our legal department looked at the different options in terms of what would make the most sense within our code, and they went within the existing anti-discrimination ordinance, but other options were considered and we saw them as being potentially viable. So that is something that we could consider, is potentially putting it elsewhere.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor. Yeah, so just a couple of things. One, I certainly am open to staff taking a look at gifts and see how they fit. I think if it's a legal source of income, it may be cleaner and smoother to incorporate all of it and not pick and choose which ones may be in there, but certainly open to staff, taking a look at that and seeing, what other cities have done, the issues that might create if we pulled one out, versus having them be more comprehensive. I know that a lot of work has been done to figure out, does this belong in the anti-discrimination ordinance or does it not? And I know that other cities tend to find that the anti-discrimination ordinance is really, where it belongs. And also that it's sort of the right thing to do. You shouldn't discriminate, on someone if they have a legal source of income, looking for housing, especially when the housing market is as tight as it is and as difficult to get in. And we know that there's data that shows when these types of solutions are put forward, one of the largest impacts is it actually gets people into areas of town that they might not have been able to get in otherwise. And that's really relying on that education piece, people not knowing how to navigate that source of income component or a voucher or whatever it may be. And that education goes such a long way of helping your small landlord help navigate that process and understand that this is something they can do. And so there's some stuff that we've seen that makes a difference. I guess one other piece of direction I might give would be to look at at whether doing just a link, would be the right way to go, or if having something printed would make a difference. And I guess my thoughts here is that if there is somebody who maybe lacks internet access, if you are doing something that maybe, isn't in somebody's first language and it's hard to navigate, that having a printed out thing may be easier for them to work with. And the other thing that we heard with some of the communication with the public was that when somebody renews their lease, that maybe that's a good opportunity to then update, any sort of changes that have been made, or to make sure that they have another copy, of those tenant rights. And I do think that there's probably a way, whether it's online or if it's printed, for there to be something on the bottom that says these may change over time. And for the most current edition, go to this link, but actually having a hard copy, I do think that there may be some value. So I guess I would just advise taking an additional look at that, maybe doing some outreach to some of the folks that we've worked with and seeing if they have any thoughts if that would be advantageous, specifically with our communities where English is a second language. Is there additional direction needed?
Nikki, do you have any questions?
No, Madam Mayor, council members, thank you. I've taken some good notes, and if you afterwards, think of anything else that you'd like to share, please let me know, and then we can kind of keep you apprised of next steps.
Great. Go ahead.
And Madam Mayor, what that might look like, I guess that would be coming back to us with any sort of input that we've taken into account. And I guess how would those next steps look like? Would that come in the form of an additional work session, a public hearing with those things incorporated? I guess my point of view is that we've done this work session, we've done the outreach, we've actually done a couple of work sessions on it now, that with potential changes that it could come in the form of an actual public hearing to get public input. And then if adopted, it would take effect on the January 1st date that you mentioned. Do you see it moving in that direction, or do you see a different path?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I guess I'd reframe the question, because that is the appropriate path to take. And Nikki, do you believe with the feedback that you received today, you could prepare ordinances for review that could then be posted for public hearing at a hearing when we come back from recess?
Madam Mayor, yes.
Okay. I'm just going to look for nods, if that makes sense for everybody.
Yes, Madam Mayor. One final question, Nikki. Thank you for all your work here. I know that you received a lot of variety of feedback. I'm just curious if there were we've had those 4 items on our list for quite some time. If there were other issues, I'm sure there were many, but that at least that there was maybe some consensus around, especially from your tenant advocacy groups, that we should be considering maybe in the future, maybe not at this point, that we need to be keeping on our radar and evaluating going forward.
Yes, Madam Mayor, Councilmember Haney Keith, absolutely. I think, as I mentioned, housing quality is something that certainly came up multiple times, and questions around whether I'm interested in digging in a bit more around whether there's an ordinance there or whether it's just a matter of city policy in terms of when somebody has some kind of housing quality issue, what is the city's kind of code team's response if what's essentially being alleged is a violation of our housing code? What does that look like? Is there a way in which there's a response that, addresses the tenant's concerns, but also doesn't expose the tenant unnecessarily to potential retaliation if someone's not happy that, code compliance got called on them? So that's something that we certainly heard questions around. I already mentioned that a lot of the conversation was around, isn't there anything we can do about increases in rents? So that is certainly a big one. And then I think there were a lot of sort of interesting beginnings of conversations around, well, what about security deposits? Is there something there? Or what about a requirement that there be registration for landlords, long-term landlords in the same way that there are for, our Airbnbs. And so I think we're kind of at those early stages with those additional questions, but we'll certainly be interested in moving those discussions forward. In addition to, I think we very much see, and this is what, we've been communicating with our stakeholders, is that it's not like these 4 tenant protections are like the perfect 4 and that's going to be it. And, everything will be done. But there's a lot more conversation to be had around the issue of housing stability and housing access. So looking forward to that continued discussion. And I think there's a lot of interest from landlords and from tenants in continuing that conversation, and have really appreciated, again, people's generosity with their time and willingness to really deeply engage around these issues.
Great. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate all the work that went into this from Nikki, but from the team, from stakeholders that were part of the feedback that we've received. Really appreciate all that you've done. And these are good next steps. I look forward to the public hearing. And we've said, as you referenced at the beginning, that we're really looking at an all of the above strategy when it comes to addressing homes and affordability for Boise budgets, and looking at ways that renters can enjoy some of the same protections and policies that we've sought in other areas is key to that as we think about housing in our community. So look forward to the public hearing. It'll be posted. Look forward to hearing from residents, renters, stakeholders, anybody at all that wants to help influence and inform this policy as we take the next steps on housing affordability for Boiseans. Thank you, Nikki, very much.
Thanks very much.
Now we've got one more. Christine Miller is with us. Christine is up here occasionally, but not all that often. So as many of you know, Christine's the Deputy Chief of Staff at the city and is here to discuss graffiti prevention and cleanup, as it's called. I asked our team, both the police department in conversations with the chief and then the team here at the city, to come up with proposals to address the cleanup of graffiti. Because what we've determined is particularly where we would like to be able to clean up quickly, but it's on private property. And so that's what this proposal aims to allow us to be able to do. And so I'll hand it over to Christine, because this is a topic that's near and dear to the hearts of many of us.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. As Mayor said, here at your request and on behalf of a very large team of city staff who's been working on this behind the scenes, our goal today very much is to check in on kind of the current state of our code, what we feel is working well, some best practice research, and then really engage you in some discussion around specific considerations so that we can get some direction before we start drafting and changing things to bring back for your consideration.
And Christine, the chief just walked in too. If
Oh, phew. Thanks, Chief. So just kind of an overview of where things sit today. We do have graffiti specifically addressed. Cleanup is very much the responsibility of the property owner, and penalties are based on the value of the damage done and cleanup costs should we be able to find the person that conducted the vandalism. Some things that are working well, and as you probably guessed from the opening slide there, investment in public art as a deterrent has been a very successful strategy and is very popular with the community. So we see that as being kind of upstream as a good practice in places where we know we're seeing issues. And finally, something that's working well, there's a really strong collaboration between police, parks, facilities, and arts and histories team on maintaining our own city-owned property. So we do not currently have like a graffiti response team at the city, but there are many departments. The arts team takes care of our public art, facilities team takes care of our facilities, parks takes care of parks. And so we, as we get into considerations, would like to talk about that a little more. When we talked about what wasn't going well and really what the main pain point is, it was, as Mayor alluded to, we really lack an abatement process and options for cleanup if that graffiti is on private property and the owner who is responsible for its cleanup is either we're having trouble getting in touch with them or they're simply unresponsive. So some numbers, because I like to work in numbers. What do trends look like? These were pulled by the police department, and this is looking at trends of graffiti reports over the past 5 years. You'll see that we are somewhere between 250, 450-ish as kind of a 5-year trend. And so far in calendar year 2023, we're probably on pace to match what we saw in 2021. So we're guessing we'll be around that 400-ish reported mark. Specific areas of concern, these reports of graffiti get coded in a couple of ways. And so when we looked back at 2022, we saw that about a third of the reports are in or near downtown. And about half of reports across the city are coded as park, playground, highway, road, or alley. So many of the frequent targets and things that get reported are in fact on public property. Only a very, very small handful were actually coded as being like on a residence, like someone's house being targeted. So just kind of a sense of numbers overall and then where we're seeing that.
Madam Mayor, quick question.
Mhm.
19 of the 400-ish are coded as residential or home. 50% are park, playground, highway, road, alley. Does the coding break down what percentage is public property versus private property? Because I think that's part of what you're going to get into later.
It is. And certainly there are many of those that are probably businesses. That's the one that we didn't break out and address specifically. But yes, I think you're headed in the direction I was hoping to lead you. Yes.
Well, that's great. You're leading me right along. I guess the question is, as if we think about what we need to do with respect to private property owners who aren't cleaning up their stuff, it'd be nice to know how many of the 400 graffiti incidents actually are those property owners. And maybe we don't know that yet, but that's okay.
And if I may, we will take that as a follow-up item to break that
of
down a
course.
little further. All right, so staff came up with a couple of goals. We said, hey, if we were asked, what do you think we ought to do? What would we say? And there really are kind of two goals that we looked at. One of the best practices, and I think what we're hearing from the community related to this concern, is really that we're getting property cleaned up as quickly as possible, and also that we're getting information documented. So it is important to police that they're able to go out and capture evidence before it's just immediately painted over. And so really, I think if we were to model our potential graffiti abatement after our current nuisance abatement model, staff felt that that might be a good way to go. And really what that would do is provide a mechanism for the city to cite and conduct the cleanup. We would propose that we have maybe some shorter time windows on that than we currently have for other nuisance abatement, but do make sure that we have enough time provided to follow due process. And then another idea that had come out of some best practice research was, if we know that there are areas that they're commonly targeted, whether those are private properties or maybe other public property owners, it's sometimes helpful just to have an agreement in place that says, hey, we know that this is a problem area. Are you okay? Would you sign this access agreement essentially for the city to be able to come onto your property and abate? A second goal that we identified was really taking shared ownership and responsibility with the community. So not getting ourselves in a position that we are the only folks that are abating graffiti in the community, but really trying to make sure that we are engaging folks. And we thought that could come in the form of strengthening both proactive and reactive communication with property owners. Some folks simply may not know, like, is this my problem or your problem? Are you cleaning it up? Am I responsible? So we thought about some opportunities there for both proactive and reactive. We do have, as I said, across our various teams in the city, some resources that could be available to assist with cleanup, and or we could consider, like we do with other nuisance abatement, simply having some contractors available and then looking at different cost recovery mechanisms. As always, police were interested in rewards for information leading to arrest or prosecution. And then really continuing to identify, as we saw earlier, those beautiful opportunities. If we know that there are areas that are frequent targets and we could do a public art installation to deter that, that would be an opportunity. And so we have for you three different kind of areas of consideration and places where staff would love some feedback and direction on which direction we might take. We would love to talk about abatement process timing. So is there kind of a target timeline that you would have? Is it, hours, days, a week? And then thoughts on how much process you would like to see in terms of, citing, providing an opportunity for the responsible party to clean it up before we would then step in and take action. So that's kind of one area, is that abatement timing and process. Second area are resources. We had talked about having some sort of mechanism to recover costs. So again, if we're seeing, back to that data we talked about earlier, if we're seeing, hey, there's a place, an underpass of a bridge that maybe is ACHD or ITD property, is that an opportunity for an interagency agreement on the cleanup and some cost recovery? And or do we want to say, hey, this is really important to us and we want to add additional staffing or funding for outsourcing cleanup? And then a final one is just a note for the legal team. They can hear me say it out loud. We are also keeping an eye on cases where graffiti might be seen as a First Amendment right, and kind of making sure that we're working within boundaries and making sure that we're really applying equal process, haste, and process regardless of the content of said graffiti. So if there are any items that you would like to specifically provide feedback on or general direction, I would love to grab some notes.
Madam Mayor. Thank you, Christine. I just want to say this part out loud too. Several years ago, I remember in the North End, there was a real issue with graffiti. And the way to address it was to kind of use best practices by addressing it quickly, covering it quickly with a neutral paint and covering it completely in like a square type shape so that you can't see any of the graffiti. And it was really effective in making sure that there wasn't more graffiti and more graffiti and more graffiti. So I don't think that that's necessarily exactly the right approach, but I would take that into account as far as timing, making sure that it's covered up, preferably within 48 hours, and making sure that it's covered up completely so that you can't kind of still see the graffiti through the spray paint that's kind of covering it up. Just get it completely covered with a neutral paint. And that seems to make it so that there's not that kind of, oh, there's already graffiti here, I'm just going to add more graffiti, and until it becomes a problem. So that's really all my feedback. And I think that recovering costs from other public agencies is likely a good idea, but we might look at maybe not recovering costs from private property owners, if that's possible.
Madam Mayor, I'll just second that last comment because it was going to be mine. I guess maybe I'm wrong. I don't know a lot about graffiti, but I perceive the private property owner whose property is vandalized to be the victim of a crime and not the perpetrator of a crime because they either can't afford to remove it or aren't attentive to it or whatever. So the person whose property has been vandalized, in my mind, as an uneducated graffiti person, does not seem like the person to be seeking to recoup costs from.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Bajent, that was staff's concern as well. This feels very different than a weed abatement, right? Where an owner has property that they haven't been caring for. It's like, well, yeah, you need to cover the cost of that because that's part of our code versus you were the victim of a crime. So I thank you for that.
Madam Mayor. Christine, it'd be helpful maybe just to understand, again, being novice in graffiti, but what some of the best practices are that we should be considering. And I see you here kind of highlighting resources and how that impacts the resources that we need to be considering in following best practices in order to handle this within our city.
Madam Mayor, Councilmember Haney Keith, when we looked, it seemed that there were kind of three areas. One of them really best practice was, as Council President alluded to, like get it covered up as quickly as possible. So it seemed like haste in process and kind of laid out agreements, things that we could do to kind of prepare the path for that, that was one of the main ones. Definitely those access agreements seem to be kind of a community oriented way to approach it, so that it wasn't simply like an enforcement, but there was participation and community commitment to like, yeah, we're all in this together and we have a vested interest in a quick path forward. And then I'm trying to think. There are all sorts of different models. When we looked at kind of our neighboring communities here in the Treasure Valley, there were very much the cite the property owner and recover the cost from the property owner at one extreme, which I think staff mostly were like, ooh, we're not really comfortable with that. All the way over to other communities where this has become like a leadership initiative and they're investing, a very large city on the West Coast, up to like $1 million in graffiti abatement. And there were all sorts of different things from staffing and contracts to like providing graffiti cleanup kits to community members. So it really kind of spanned, but I think truly the best practice appeared to be find as quick a route as you can to getting it cleaned up and abated. And then from there, is it more of a community engagement approach, more of an enforcement approach? All of those models are out there.
And Mayor, I guess the only other thing that I would add is that I do think going as fast as possible and cleaning up as fast as possible is really important, and doing it, I think you worded it, abatement with equal haste and process regardless of content, I think is a great way to do it as well. And to the extent possible with staff and what's realistic, I guess I would certainly encourage us to move at that sort of speed. I think my hope would be is that if we do that, we actually start getting less graffiti over time, because people know that it's just not going to be up and it's not going to be as effective. And so it'd be really interesting to know, after these processes go in place, a year from now, if that's really been working, and kind of getting an eye on, has this reduced, the amount of graffiti that we have to respond to, or is there additional stuff that we have to do? But I think that this is just an excellent step in the right direction.
All right. Well, Christine, you did well. You came up with the best practices to meet our goals of covering this stuff up quickly, taking care of people. And so yes, the next steps would be to return with a draft ordinance.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We do not have an executive session. Nope. All right. Well, then we will recess until 6 o'clock. Thanks, everybody.